At some point in your life, someone told you about hell. Maybe when you were a child, maybe from a pulpit, maybe in the quiet voice of a parent trying to explain why certain things were wrong. And it lended the image of fire, of permanent suffering, of a door that closes forever. Even people who stopped believing in hell a long time ago carry some version of that image somewhere in the back of their minds. That image is one of the most powerful ideas in the history of Western civilization. It shaped laws, ended careers, started wars, kept people in line for centuries, and made institutions extraordinarily wealthy and powerful. And most people who grew up with it have never been told where it actually came from. The answer is stranger than you'd expect, and more instructive, because the hell that most people fear, the place of fire and eternal punishment, did not arrive fully formed in the pages of Scripture. It was built slowly, deliberately, across centuries, by human hands, for human purposes. And understanding how it was built and why might be one of the most spiritually liberating things you can do. Let's start at the beginning, not with fire, with silence. The oldest Hebrew word for the place of the dead is Sheol. And Sheol is not a place of punishment. It is not a place of fire. It is not even a particularly frightening place in most of its biblical appearances. It is simply the realm of the dead, a shadowy, quiet underworld where everyone goes, the righteous and the wicked alike, kings and servants, those who lived well and those who didn't. There is no sorting at the door. There is no difference in destination based on how you lived. There is no suffering waiting on the other side. There is just absence, the end of earthly life, and a kind of dim, gray continuation in the dark. The book of Ecclesiastes says plainly that in Sheol there is no work, no thought, no knowledge, and no wisdom. The Psalms describe it as a place of silence, a place where God is not praised. Even the most beloved and the most faithful ended up there. It was not a threat. It was simply the horizon of human life. The Greeks had something remarkably similar. Hades, named for the god who ruled it, was not a realm of torture. It was shadow. The dead wandered its gray banks without great suffering, without great joy. There was Elysium for the heroic, Tartarus for the truly monstrous. But the vast majority of the dead ended up somewhere in the middle, in a gray sort of continuation that was less frightening than simply sad and dim. The poet Homer describes the dead as squeaking and fluttering like bats, pale echoes of what they were. Both Sheol and Hades share the same essential quality. They are passive. The dead are not being punished. They are simply there, existing in a diminished form, waiting, perhaps, for something, but not burning. When Jesus speaks of what gets translated as hell in the Gospels, he uses a different word almost every time. Gehenna, and Gehenna was not a mythological underworld. It was a real place. A valley just outside the walls of Jerusalem, known in Hebrew as the Valley of Hinnom, that had a deeply grim historical reputation. In earlier periods, according to the Hebrew scriptures, it had been a site where certain kings permitted child sacrifice to foreign deities, a practice that the prophets condemned in some of the strongest language anywhere in the Bible. The association with fire, with burning, with the worst of human transgression, was already embedded in the name long before Jesus used it. By the time of Jesus, the valley had become Jerusalem's primary refuge site. Things that had no place in the city, waste, the discarded, the contaminated, were burned there. Some historical sources suggest it was also used for the bodies of criminals and the very poor who had no one to claim them. It was a place associated with rejection, with the end of usefulness, with things consumed and gone. When Jesus says that certain paths lead to Gehenna, everyone listening could see that valley from the city walls. He was not describing a location in another dimension. He was using a specific, familiar, physically present symbol to talk about the real consequences of certain ways of living. Whether he intended this as metaphor or as literal description of an afterlife geography is a question that's serious biblical. Scholars have debated across centuries, and the honest answer is that the text does not definitively resolve it. What the text does show is that Jesus who talked about consequences with urgency, using the most vivid available language, without providing the architectural blueprint of eternal torment that later centuries would build around his words. What matters is what came after, because the image of Gehenna, of fire and rejection and waste, was taken by subsequent centuries and transformed into something far more architecturally specific, far more politically useful, and far more frightening than any refuse valley outside Jerusalem could ever be. Here is what actually happened to the idea of hell between the 1st century and the 14th, and why it happened. The early centuries of Christianity were a period of genuine doctrinal uncertainty about almost everything, including the afterlife. Different teachers held different positions. Some emphasized resurrection and a coming judgment at the end of history. Some emphasized an immediate accounting at death. Some expected history itself to end soon, which would resolve all questions quickly. The idea of hell as a specific, permanent, detailed location of eternal torment was one position among several, not an established consensus held everywhere from the beginning. What changed was power. Between roughly the 11th and 14th centuries, the Western Church underwent an extraordinary expansion of institutional authority. The Crusades were called with papal blessing, promising spiritual rewards to those who fought and threatening spiritual consequences for those who refused. The Inquisition was established to identify and prosecute theological deviation. The formal doctrine of Papal supremacy was developed and enforced. The Church was not just a spiritual community. It was the most powerful political institution in the Western world, with a demonstrated ability to make and unmake kings, to determine who was included in the community of the saved and who was excluded, to reach into the most intimate decisions of ordinary life and pronounce them acceptable or damned. And hell became the load-bearing wall of that architecture. Think about what it means, practically, to believe in hell as the medieval church presented it, not as a philosophical idea held at intellectual distance, but as a lived, bodily, concrete reality. You believe that after death, certain choices you made in life will result in physical suffering of infinite duration, with no possibility of relief, no end, no appeal, no parole. Forever, without exception. And you believe that someone can tell you which choices trigger that outcome. And you believe that the institution standing in front of you has unique access to the knowledge and the sacraments required to help you avoid it. That is not just a theological position. That is leverage. The most powerful leverage imaginable. The threat of infinite suffering without end produces compliance that no earthly punishment could approach, because no earthly punishment is infinite. Look at what that leverage was actually used for. Heresy, meaning disagreement with official doctrinal positions, was treated not merely as intellectual error, but as a crime against God with eternal consequences. The threat of hell and of excommunication, which in this period was understood as closing the door to salvation, was deployed against political opponents of the papacy, against secular rulers who challenged church authority, against reformers who questioned specific church practices, against people who asked questions that the institution found inconvenient. The sale of indulgences, one of the sparks that eventually lit the Reformation, was essentially a financial transaction built on the architecture of hell. Pay a certain sum, and the church would reduce the time your soul or a deceased loved one spent in purgatory. The logic only works if you accept that the church has authority over what happens to your soul after death. And the only reason you accept that is if you believe the church controls the gate between you and eternal fire. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is documented history. The same letters that promoted indulgences, written by church officials, explicitly described the money being raised and the political uses it would be put to. The architecture of eternal damnation was functioning as a revenue mechanism, not for all clergy, many of whom were genuinely devoted and spiritually serious people, but for the institution as a structure. Hell was indispensable infrastructure. And then came Dante. In the early 14th century, the Italian poet Dante Alighieri wrote the Inferno, the first part of his three-part Divine Comedy. It is one of the most extraordinary literary works ever produced in any language, and it is also, quietly, one of the most politically motivated documents of its era. Dante's Hell is a work of astonishing detail and imagination. 9 circles, descending in severity, each dedicated to a specific category of sin, each with its own corresponding punishment designed to mirror the nature of the offense. Gluttons lie in filth. In the rain, flatterers are submerged in excrement. Fraudsters burn in pits. The architecture is precise, elaborate, and visually overwhelming in the way that only the greatest art can manage, and placed carefully within those circles, in exactly the appropriate locations of suffering, are Dante's personal enemies. Real people. Politicians who had wronged him, popes he despised, rivals he wanted to discredit. The Inferno is not only theology. It is, among other things, a literary act of settling accounts dressed in the robes of spiritual truth. Dante was writing fiction. Extraordinarily gifted, theologically informed, deeply serious fiction. But fiction, the 9 circles of hell, the specific contrapasso punishments, the geography of eternal suffering, these were his inventions, drawn from theological sources but assembled and amplified by his imagination for artistic and political purposes. What happened next is one of the most consequential mistakes in the history of Western religious culture. Over the following centuries, as the Divine Comedy spread and was read and preached and illustrated and dramatized, Dante's invented architecture rovelle merged in the popular imagination with the actual biblical text. The circles became canonical, the punishments became assumed. The geography of hell that most people in the Western world carry in their minds today, whether they are religious or not, owes more to Dante Alighieri's 14th century imagination than to any passage in Scripture. The image of hell that made people afraid for 500 years was substantially the creation of one man's literary genius, deployed partly for spiritual purposes and partly for personal ones. Now, here is where the history becomes something more than history, because something genuinely powerful and real was being gestured at underneath all of this construction. The sense that choices have weight, that darkness exists, that there is something in human experience that functions like what the tradition was calling hell, some interior state of being cut off from light, from meaning, from connection, that is real and that is terrible. The question is whether that real thing requires eternal fire to describe it accurately. In the tradition of Kabbalah, the ancient mystical dimension of Judaism, there is a concept that offers one of the most profound and psychologically honest takes on this question that I have ever encountered. And it does not require you to be Jewish or religious in any particular way to find it true way. The tradition speaks of what are called the klipit. The word means husks, or shells, or coverings. In Kabbalistic understanding, the klipit represent the forces of darkness, of limitation, of concealment in the world. They are the husks that cover the divine sparks scattered through all of creation. And here is the part that changes everything. In this tradition, the klipit are not the enemy of creation. They are part of it. They were woven into the fabric of existence, deliberately, not as a mistake, not as the intrusion of an outside evil, but as a structural necessity. Without the klipit, without the husks that conceal and limit and obscure the light would have nothing to reveal itself against. There would be no distinction between light and darkness, which means there would be no way to perceive the light at all. There would be no choice, because choice requires the existence of alternatives. There would be no growth, because growth requires the existence of resistance. And there would be no evolution, because evolution requires something to move through. In plain language, you cannot know warmth if you have never been cold. You cannot know connection if you have never felt alone. You cannot find your way to the light if you have never been in the dark. The klipit, the forces of darkness and shadow and limitation, are not the opposite of God's creation. They are the conditions that make it possible for a soul to do anything at all with the life it has been given. This completely reframes what hell might actually mean, spiritually. Not a destination, not a punishment, but a description of a particular kind of interior experience, the experience of being fully enclosed in the husk, separated from the light, unable to see or feel or access the divine that is present everywhere but hidden from you. That experience is real. It is devastating, and the mystical tradition does not deny it. What it denies is that it is the final word. Because the same tradition that describes the clip, it also describes the work of refining and elevating the divine sparks within them. The darkness is not where you stay. It is where you do the work that changes you enough to move. Think about your own life for a moment. Every time you grew as a person, genuinely grew, not just felt comfortable, but actually changed and developed and became more than you were. Was it because everything was easy? Or was it because something broke, something failed, something pushed you into a place where you had no choice but to find a new way? The Kabbalistic tradition would say, that is not accidental, that is the function of the shadow. And it goes further. The tradition teaches that the work of a human life is not to escape the darkness, but to encounter it honestly, to face the shadow rather than run from it, to integrate what is difficult rather than project it outward onto enemies and scapegoats. This is the work of spiritual evolution, not the avoidance of hell, but the transformation of what hell represents. The difficult, the shadowed, the broken parts of yourself into something that serves your growth rather than imprisoning you. Carl Jung, working in a completely different tradition. The tradition of modern psychology arrived at a remarkably similar place from a completely different direction. He called this work the encounter with the shadow, the psychological material we push down, deny, and project onto other people, the parts of ourselves we find unacceptable, threatening, or painful to look at. His insight was direct and practical. A person who has not faced their own shadow has not really begun the work of becoming whole. The shadow doesn't disappear when you refuse to look at it. It doesn't dissolve when you label it evil and reject it. It drives you from underground. It shows up in your relationships, in your reactions, in the patterns that repeat in your life, with a frequency that doesn't make sense until you understand what's underneath them. The encounter with the shadow is not a punishment. It is the essential beginning of genuine self-knowledge, and genuine self-knowledge is the beginning of genuine spiritual maturity. Saint John of the Cross, a 16th century Spanish mystic who had experienced imprisonment by the very church he served, wrote about what he called the dark night of the soul with a specificity that only comes from having been there. He described a period of spiritual desolation so complete that all consolation fails, that prayer feels empty, that God seems absent, that the person is left in what feels exactly like total abandonment. Everything that had been providing spiritual comfort falls away. Everything false. Everything that was substituting for a genuine encounter with the divine. His insight was not that this darkness was a punishment. His insight was that it was necessary. The stripping away of the false, the artificial, the attached, the things that had been standing in the place of real relationship with God, had they happened before something real could be found. The dark night was not the absence of God. It was the removal of everything that had been blocking the actual presence of God from being experienced directly. 3 traditions, 3 entirely different vocabularies and frameworks, the same essential observation. The darkness is not the enemy of the light. The darkness is where the real work happens. The darkness is the teacher. Now hold this against the hell that was constructed and deployed for political use in the medieval period. That hell required eternal duration. Not a period of purification you could move through. Not a dark night that ends in dawn. Eternal. Without end. Forever. And the specific reason it required eternal duration is not spiritual. It is operational. A temporary hell, a hell that you pass through and emerge from changed, does not produce the same behavioral compliance. You can still reason with people about a hell that ends. You can still negotiate with the possibility of eventual release. But eternal hell, hell with no exit, no appeal, and no end, produces a different quality of obedience entirely. A temporary hell is a consequence. An eternal hell is a hostage situation. The permanence was not derived from deep spiritual wisdom about the nature of the divine. It was a design feature that served the institution, and the institution understood this clearly enough to defend it with extraordinary force, to declare alternative views heretical, and to apply serious, earthly consequences. To anyone who questioned it, the mystical traditions that offered a different account, the traditions that described darkness as a passage and not a prison, were consistently marginalized, suppressed, or absorbed in ways that neutralized their challenge to the institutional narrative. Not universally, not completely. The mystics kept writing, and some of their writing survived, and you can read it today. But they did not shape the popular religion of the medieval period the way the preacher with hell as his primary argument shaped it. The medieval church did not invent the fear of death and darkness. That fear is as old as human consciousness. What it did was capture that fear and channel it, shape it into a specific architectural form that required the church's own services to navigate, and then use it to govern an entire civilization. Remove the institutional design, and what you are left with is the original and genuine observation. The darkness is real. The experience of being lost, of being cut off from light and meaning and connection, is one of the most powerful and universal experiences of human life. And it matters. What you do in the dark matters. Whether you face it or flee it matters. What does not seem to be true, spiritually, is that a God who made you, who placed something divine in you by the very act of creating you, designed a system in which you could burn forever without recourse, without possibility of change, without the possibility of the very growth that the darkness in your life was always meant to produce. Because if the darkness is a teacher, as the Kabbalistic tradition and the mystics and the great psychologists of the 20th century all converge in suggesting, then the idea that the teacher leads only to an eternal exam with no possibility of passing after death is not a spiritual insight. It is a design meant to make you afraid, and fear, as a long-term spiritual orientation, does not produce the kind of relationship with God that any genuine tradition has ever described as the goal. What it produces is compliance, which is useful if you are running an institution, and not particularly useful if you are trying to help a human soul find its way to something real. The history of hell, honestly told, is in large part the history of fear being organized, branded, and deployed as a management tool. But underneath that history, underneath all the circles and the fire and the theological architecture, built for purposes that have nothing to do with your soul, something genuine was always there. The recognition that darkness is real, that it has weight and consequence, that how you navigate it matters in ways that outlast the moment you're in. The recognition that there are places within human experience that feel like hell because in some very real sense they are. States of total disconnection, of profound lostness, of being unable to see any light from where you are standing, and the recognition but carried most clearly in the mystical traditions that power structures never quite managed to fully suppress, that those places are not where you are condemned to stay. They are where you are being changed. The ebook, Reconnecting with Your Divine Essence, was written for exactly this territory. The dark places that feel permanent, the disconnection that feels final, and the path back to the part of you that was never actually separated from the divine in the first place. If you feel drawn to that exploration, the link is in the description. And the question that remains, what if hell, in the most honest and most useful sense, is not where God sends you for what you did wrong? What if hell is what you experience when you are most deeply separated from the truth of what you actually are? And what if the path through it has always been the same? Not escape, not suppression, not compliance with an institution that promises to save you from it, but the honest encounter with your own darkness, the willingness to face the shadow rather than flee from it, and the discovery that on the other side of the shadow, the light was always there. The fire went out in the medieval torture chambers of theological imagination a long time ago. What has never gone out is the darkness that asks you to grow, and what has never been extinguished, no matter how many centuries of fear were piled on top of it, is the light you were made of.